For 6 long years, he waited behind the same metal bars, while everyone else got adopted. People walked past him. Volunteers cried for him. But no one took him home. Until one day, someone did something no one expected, and what happened next will break your heart in the best way. His name was Shadow. He had arrived at the shelter as a young German shepherd, strong, alert, and full of life. That was 2,038 days ago. Now he was 8 years old, and still waiting. Every morning, the staff opened the rows of kennels to clean and feed, and every morning, Shadow stood up, walked to the front, and sat down. Tall, ears perked, waiting for someone to stop, someone to look past the gray around his eyes, someone to see the dog he still was underneath the time in the bars. But no one ever did. The volunteers adored him. He was gentle. He never barked when people passed by. He let children pet him through the bars without flinching. He was patient when other dogs barked and growled around him. He never pushed forward or begged, but week after week, year after year, he was passed over, too big, too old, too serious. The label stuck, and so did he. One of the newer volunteers, a 27-year-old woman named Emily, had been coming to the shelter for about 2 months when she first noticed him. He didn't do what the other dogs did, jumping, pacing, barking. He just sat, straight-backed, eyes calm, watching. There was something haunting in it. Not because he seemed broken, but because he seemed like he had given up hoping anyone would choose him. One afternoon, Emily asked the shelter coordinator, Maggie, "Why is he still here?" Maggie sighed. "Shadow's our old soul. Came in after his owner died in a fire. Had no chip, no relatives. He's healthy, he's sweet. But what? No one wants the dog that's been waiting the longest. People think there's something wrong with him." Emily looked back toward the kennel. Shadow was sitting again, quiet, still, dignified, and alone. That night, Emily couldn't sleep. She kept picturing those eyes. Not desperate, just tired. She pulled out her phone and posted on social media. "This is Shadow. He's been in a shelter for 6 years. Never had a single adoption. Never even a trial. Please share his story." She hit post and went to bed, not expecting much. By morning, the post had been shared over 2,000 times. By noon, 20,000. And by nightfall, national news outlets were asking to cover the story. But what no one expected was who saw that post next, and what they said when they called the shelter. It wasn't just emotional, it changed everything about Shadow's story. The next morning, the shelter was buzzing. Phones rang. Emails flooded in. Volunteers whispered as they passed Shadow's kennel. Some with smiles, some with tears they tried to hide. The post had gone viral. More than 50,000 shares in under 24 hours. Offers came in from as far as Washington, Oregon, even Canada. But it wasn't the volume that surprised everyone. It was one message in particular. Emily stood in the office with Maggie, holding her phone in both hands. She read the message out loud, her voice trembling just slightly. "I think that's the dog I lost. His name was Max. I've been looking for him for years. Please, tell me it's really him." Daniel Rivers. Maggie narrowed her eyes. "You think it's legit?" Emily turned the phone toward her. "He attached pictures. Look." They scrolled through images taken 8 years earlier, before the fire. A younger version of Shadow running through snow, lying on a living room rug, sitting beside a man with a beard and soft eyes. Same ears. Same white patch under the chin. Same steady gaze. "It's him," Maggie whispered. Emily swallowed. "What do we do?" "We get him here, fast." 2 days later, the shelter parking lot was quiet until a silver SUV pulled in. The man who stepped out looked weathered, maybe late 30s, jeans and flannel shirt, eyes glassy before he even reached the door. Daniel had been searching for his dog, Max, since the fire that destroyed his cabin. He'd been hospitalized for months. When he finally got out, no one knew where Max had gone. The shelter that had taken him in had long since shut down, and records were never transferred. He had assumed Max, Shadow, was gone, but then he saw the photo in Emily's post, and everything inside him collapsed. He knew. Maggie led Daniel through the back hallway toward Shadow's kennel. The old shepherd was lying on a padded blanket, resting his head over his front paws, when he heard the footsteps. He lifted his head, then froze. For a moment, no one moved. Emily watched from the side, barely breathing. Daniel stepped closer, slowly, and knelt just outside the bars. "Max," he whispered. The dog blinked, tilted his head. The name stirred something in his body, as if it had been buried under years of silence. Then, without barking, without hesitation, he stood up, walked to the gate, and sat down, just like always. Except this time he wasn't looking through a stranger. He was looking into the eyes of the man he'd never stopped waiting for. Daniel reached through the bars, hand trembling, and touched the side of Max's face. The dog didn't flinch. He leaned in, gently, slowly. And then, a sound escaped Max's throat, a soft, shaky whimper. His tail thumped the floor, once, twice, then faster. Maggie turned away, wiping her eyes. Emily stood frozen, hands over her mouth. Daniel's voice cracked. "I thought you were gone." Max nudged his nose into Daniel's chest, breathing him in, recognizing what 6 years hadn't erased. Home. That afternoon, the adoption papers were signed. No questions, no waiting period. Not this time. Everyone in the shelter lined up to say goodbye. Staff, volunteers, even other adopters who had followed the story online and showed up just to see him leave. Shadow, now Max again, walked proudly beside Daniel toward the front door, tail wagging, steps sure. As they reached the exit, Max paused, turned around, and looked back down the hallway he'd walked for 6 years, then turned forward and walked out. Into the sunlight, into freedom, into everything he thought he'd lost. But what neither of them knew was that Max's story wasn't over. Because once he was finally home, he would do something that would leave Daniel, Emily, and everyone who followed his story absolutely speechless. The first few days back home were quiet. Daniel lived in a small, cozy rental house just outside of Boulder, Colorado. Nothing fancy, just a fireplace, a couch, and a few framed photos from a life that had once been full and then torn apart. Now it was full again, with paws padding across wood floors, with water lapping in a bowl, with the sound of a sigh before sleep. Max had claimed the living room rug within minutes, as if it had always been his. Daniel couldn't stop watching him, not obsessively, just in awe. The way Max moved, the way he scanned the room before settling in, the way he followed Daniel with quiet steps, like he was still making sure it wasn't all a dream. Sometimes at night, Daniel would wake up and find Max curled at the side of his bed, eyes open, breathing slow, as if he was guarding something or someone. One morning, after a walk along the creek, Daniel decided to visit the old cabin site for the first time since the fire. Max sat in the back seat of the SUV, calm but alert. The closer they got, the more Daniel noticed the shift. The ears perked higher, the eyes narrowed. The memories were heavy. When they arrived, the ruins were barely visible, just blackened boards and moss covering the past. The land was quiet now, peaceful. Daniel stepped out. So did Max. But he didn't walk forward. He stopped and stared toward the edge of the forest. Daniel followed his gaze. "Max?" he said softly. The dog didn't move. He was locked on something, then he took off. Not in panic, in purpose. Daniel called after him, heart racing. He followed Max down the slope, through bramble and brush, until they reached a narrow clearing by the creek. Max stood still, ears twitching. And then Daniel heard it too. Crying. He pushed through the last of the brush and froze. There, curled near the base of a fallen tree, was a child. No older than 4, shoes muddy, jacket torn, face red from cold and fear. Max approached slowly, crouching low, tail wagging gently. The child whimpered, then reached out, and Max let her touch him. Daniel moved in fast, pulling off his jacket. "Hey, sweetheart," he said gently. "It's okay, you're okay now." She didn't speak, just clung to Max's fur. A search party had been out since sunrise, Daniel would learn later. A little girl named Abby, who'd wandered from her grandparents' house during a hike the night before. No one had found her, until Max did. The sheriff said it best. "We would have lost her by nightfall. Your dog saved her." News of the rescue spread faster than the original adoption story. Max, the shelter dog who waited 6 years, had become a hero. Not trained for search and rescue, not bred for it, but led by something else. A memory, a bond, a sense that he had been given a second chance. And now, he had to give one back. That night, Daniel sat by the fire, Max curled at his side. The wind moved outside like a whisper. He looked down and said quietly, "You weren't waiting for a family, were you?" Max looked up. "You were waiting for a moment." Max didn't wag his tail. He didn't bark. He just laid his head on Daniel's lap and closed his eyes. Because some souls don't just survive what they've lost. They rise and carry others out of the dark with them. But there's still more to come. Because Emily hadn't forgotten Max, and what she was about to offer him would open a whole new chapter in his life. 3 weeks after Max rescued little Abby, the phone at Daniel's house rang. It was Maggie from the shelter. She was breathless with excitement. "You're not going to believe this," she said. "Emily's here. She wants to see Max again." Daniel didn't even hesitate. "Tell her to come by, anytime." Emily arrived just after noon the next day. She stepped out of her small car wearing jeans, a gray hoodie, and eyes that were already welling with emotion before she even knocked on the door. Daniel opened it slowly. They didn't speak right away. They didn't need to. Max was already standing in the hallway, ears forward, head tilted. He walked forward, no rush, no hesitation, and sat right in front of her. Emily knelt down. Her hands shook as she ran them along the fur behind his ears. "Hey boy," she whispered. "I knew someone would see you. I just didn't think it would happen like this." Max leaned into her, eyes closed, tail sweeping softly across the floor. Daniel watched the scene quietly, arms crossed, jaw clenched against the wave rising in his chest. They sat for over an hour. Emily told stories from the shelter, how she used to walk by his kennel and whisper things like, "You're worth it," and "Hold on." She told Daniel how she posted his photo that night, not because she thought it would go viral, but because she couldn't live with herself if he died in that cage. And then she said something Daniel didn't expect. I want to start something, a project, a program. I don't have a name for it yet, but I want to help dogs like Max, the ones nobody sees, the ones that wait for years and don't get a second chance. And I want Max to be part of it. Daniel blinked. What do you mean? Therapy visits, school talks, shelter visits, a story that travels. People listen to stories like his, they remember them. She hesitated. I know it's asking a lot, but I believe he was meant for more than just being saved. He was meant to show people that it's never too late. Daniel looked at Max. The old shepherd lay calmly at Emily's feet, looking up at her with the kind of patience that only comes from someone who's seen the worst and chosen to stay soft anyway. Daniel took a breath and nodded. Let's do it. The first visit was to a middle school. Emily and Daniel stood in the auditorium as 207th graders listened to the story of a dog who waited 6 years in a shelter and then saved a life. Max lay quietly beside Daniel's chair until the Q&A. That's when a boy in the front row raised his hand and said, "How did he know where to find the girl?" Daniel didn't answer. Instead, he leaned down, rubbed Max's ear, and said, "He didn't. He just never stopped believing that someone still needed him." The room was silent. Then one student clapped. Then another. And then the whole room stood. For a dog who never gave up. Over the next months, the program grew. Max visited other schools, other shelters. He comforted veterans in recovery centers. He stood beside children in courtrooms. He sat quietly next to kids learning to read for the first time. He never barked, never demanded attention. He just showed up. And in his silence, he told the loudest truth. You are not too old. You are not too late. You are still needed. But there was one visit left. One place he hadn't returned to. The place where he had waited. And waited what? And waited. And now, he was going back. Not as a shelter dog, but as a symbol of hope. The sun was just starting to rise when Daniel pulled into the parking lot of the shelter, the same parking lot he'd first walked across, heart pounding, unsure if Shadow, now Max, would even recognize him. That day had felt like the end of a chapter. Today, it felt like the start of something bigger. Emily was already waiting by the front door. She had on her volunteer shirt, faded from years of washes, and her old name tag, Emily K. Volunteer since 2020. The moment Daniel stepped out of the truck, Max leapt down gracefully. His body moved with the confidence of a dog who knew who he was now. Not a cage number, not unadoptable, not forgotten. He was Max, and he was home. But not to stay. This time he had a mission. The shelter hadn't changed much. Same gray walls, same faint scent of bleach and fur, same row of kennels stretching down the hallway like a tunnel of second chances waiting to be seen. But the staff, they were different. When they saw Max walk through the front door, tails wagging started all down the hallway. From behind bars, from dogs still waiting, from dogs who maybe felt the shift in the air. Because Max was proof that the wait could end. Maggie stepped out from her office, a clipboard in one hand and a tissue in the other. I knew this would break me, she laughed through tears. She knelt down and Max walked straight to her. She pressed her forehead against his and whispered, You did it, boy. You made them all believe. They had prepared something special. Emily led Max and Daniel to the end of the hallway. There, where his old kennel used to be, was a glass panel display. A plaque above it read, Shadow, now Max. He waited 6 years, and then changed lives forever. Inside the display were photos of Max over the years, behind the bars, in the news, with Abby, at the schools, with Daniel, and at the center, his original ID tag, Cage S12. Emily reached into her backpack and pulled out a brand new tag. This one read, Ambassador, Max, from Shelter Dog to Hope Giver. Daniel fastened it gently to Max's collar. Max wagged once, then sat beside the glass panel, calm and still, just like he had so many times before. Only now, the people passing by weren't strangers ignoring him. They were visitors stopping to read about him. They were children kneeling to wave. They were new adopters, asking if they could meet the dog who waited. And Max didn't flinch. He let them come. He let them touch. He let them cry. Because he understood. This place was no longer a prison. It was a beginning. And he was its proof. Later that day, Max did something no one expected. As Emily gave a small speech in front of the staff and visitors, Max stood up, left Daniel's side, and walked to one of the nearby kennels. Inside was a shy, scared-looking pit bull mix named Benny, who had been returned twice. Max sat down outside the kennel, didn't bark, didn't move, just waited. And within a few minutes, Benny crept forward and placed his paw on the gate, the same way Max had once done for Emily. The shelter coordinator wiped her eyes again. I think he just picked the next one, she whispered. By sunset, Max was back in the truck, head resting on the armrest between the seats. Daniel looked over and whispered, You ready to go? Max closed his eyes, his tail tapping once, a soft yes. That night, Emily posted a photo. Max sitting in front of his own display. The caption read, He came back to show them it's possible. Max doesn't live in a kennel anymore. He lives in hearts. The post reached over 1 million people in less than 48 hours. Donations poured in, more adoptions followed, and dogs who had been waiting for months or years finally went home. Because one dog had waited longer and made it mean something. But Max still had one final journey to make. One last chapter he had to close. The place where he was born, and where his story almost ended, before it ever began. It was a quiet Sunday morning when Daniel opened the drawer and pulled out the old manila envelope. The edges were worn, corners bent from years of being moved but never opened. Inside was a printout he had avoided for nearly a decade. The fire report. One address circled in red. 781 Franklin Hill Road. The cabin that burned. The place he once called home. The place where Max was born. The place where he was lost. And now, the place that they would return to. They drove in silence for over an hour. The road curved up into the hills, narrowing into a gravel path swallowed by overgrowth. Daniel hadn't been back since the fire. What was once his sanctuary had become a scar on the map. Max stood in the back seat, nose pressed to the cracked window, tail still, alert, as if he knew. When they reached the gate, Daniel got out and walked up the old path. Max followed, slower now, ears flicking in every direction, tail low but not tucked. The cabin was gone. In its place, a clearing. Some of the foundation stones were still visible. A blackened chimney still stood crooked, like a broken tooth in the middle of the earth. The air smelled of pine and moss and old ash. Daniel crouched and touched the ground. I thought you died here, he whispered. Max didn't respond. He just sat beside him. Then, he stood up and walked. Daniel followed as Max made his way toward the edge of the clearing. He sniffed, paused, then turned sharply toward a thicket of trees. And there, hidden by brush and vines, was something neither of them expected. The old training shed, still standing, roof partially caved, door leaning on one hinge. Inside, Daniel had once kept food bins, toys, training cones, and Max's first collar. He pulled the door open slowly. The smell of smoke and rot rushed out. But under the mess, Max walked inside. He sniffed to the far corner and stopped. There, buried under a charred plastic bin, was a worn, partially melted red ball. Daniel picked it up gently. Max wagged. Once, then nudged the ball with his nose, and lay down. It was a memory, a confirmation, a closing loop. Daniel sat beside him, placing the ball between them. You survived this, he whispered, and you became more than I ever imagined. Max rolled onto his side, pressed against Daniel's leg, and let out a deep sigh, the kind only a dog can release when a part of their soul finally exhales. The next day, Daniel and Emily filed paperwork to officially purchase the land, not to rebuild the cabin, not for a home, but for something bigger. They would call it Max's Field, a private, peaceful sanctuary where older and long-term shelter dogs could be free, even if they never found a home. Because Max had taught them, sometimes the place you were meant to be isn't behind a fence. It's in the space between where you were broken and where you chose to heal. In the weeks that followed, the story spread again. Volunteers signed up to help clear the land. Builders offered to donate fencing. Children wrote letters to Max, thanking him for saving Abby, for waiting 6 years, for showing the world that even the forgotten can become the unforgettable. And one evening, just before the first foundation stone for Max's Field was laid, Daniel sat in the grass beside him. You ready to let others rest where you once broke? Max leaned his head on Daniel's lap and closed his eyes. Yes. But there was still one final chapter left to write. One final visit. Not for Max, but for someone else who never stopped loving him. The first letter arrived in a plain white envelope, no return address, just a postmark from Vermont and a shaky handwritten label, to whoever has Max. Inside was a folded sheet of paper and an old photo. Max as a puppy, no more than 6 weeks old, licking peanut butter from a little girl's cheek. Daniel sat on the porch, reading slowly. His name was Bear when I had him. My dad surprised me with him on my 10th birthday. We were best friends for 2 years. Then my parents split. We lost the house. I lost Bear. I've looked for him ever since. When I saw him on the news, I knew it was him. I don't need him back. I just needed to know he's okay. Thank you for giving him the life I couldn't. MS. Daniel blinked away tears. He looked at Max, now curled in the grass nearby, watching birds flicker through the sky. People don't just remember you, he said aloud. They carry you. More letters followed. From shelter volunteers, from former staff, from a man who said he'd nearly adopted Max 3 years earlier and had never forgiven himself for walking away. From Abby's mother, who now took Abby to a local rescue every Saturday to read books to the dogs. Each letter had one thing in common. Max had changed something. In someone. Forever. Then one day, Emily arrived at Daniel's home carrying a box. What's that? He asked. She placed it on the porch table and opened it carefully. Inside was a leather-bound book with a photo of Max on the cover. The Dog Who Waited, by Emily and Max, a self-published children's book. 30 pages, simple drawings, simple words, a powerful message. Sometimes the dog you pass by is the one who will save your life someday. Daniel flipped through the pages slowly, then closed the book and hugged her. Hard. That weekend, Max made his final public appearance. At the opening ceremony for Max's Field, children ran through the grass, Old shelter dogs lay under the shade of trees. A plaque was unveiled. Max waited 6 years. Now no dog will ever wait alone again. Max sat beside the stone, still, peaceful, whole. That night, back home, Daniel sat on the floor beside him. "Can I tell you something?" he whispered. Max lifted his head. "I thought I was rescuing you," he smiled, "but you were rescuing me all along." Max passed away quietly 3 weeks later. No pain, no fear. Just a breath in, a breath out, and a life that had given more than it ever took. But his story didn't end there, because Max's field grew. Emily's book reached classrooms across the country. The shelter's adoption rate tripled. And Daniel? He still sat on the porch every morning. Not in grief, but in gratitude. Because Max had taught the world something beautiful. You are never too old, never too broken, never too forgotten to become someone's hero. If Max's story touched your heart, remember, every shelter dog is waiting for a moment like his. You can be the one who gives it to them. Subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share it with someone who believes in second chances. Together, let's make sure no dog waits forever.